Please help me in welcoming Linda Bevilacqua.
Ooh, okay. Can I just say, they told me there was going to be a television screen down there where I could see my presentation. Thank you for putting the slide up, because what I saw was myself, and it scared me. Okay. First of all, thank you, Jill, and thank you so much, Team CFA, for inviting me to this conference. I've lost count, honestly, of the number of conferences that I've been to, but the last 2 days remind me why I so love being here. It's an opportunity to share ideas, to become re-energized. The sessions that I was privileged to sit in this morning, and I always tend to be drawn particularly to the sessions that are designed to appeal to teachers. They're the sessions that teachers are actually presenting, and there are lots of teachers in the audience. I'm drawn to them because that's where my heart is and started, and that was in the classroom with kids. Can I just give a shout out to all of you that are here presenting and say, oh my gosh, you're an inspiration to me. Kudos to each and every one of you. So, the title of my presentation today is The Education All Children Deserve, and the subtitle, Implementing Core Knowledge with Fidelity for Optimal Impact. Now, I know everyone in this room is familiar with core knowledge. We know that it is the curriculum of choice in all Team CFA schools. We know that when we talk about core knowledge, it's the curricular approach that makes building a broad foundation of knowledge a primary objective of the elementary school experience. But what I want to do today is to take a deeper dive to look at what it means to implement core knowledge, and specifically what it means to implement it well. Before I do, however, I want to provide some context. You know, Robert yesterday in his talk mentioned that speaking at a Team CFA conference is something like preaching to the choir. You guys get it. You know that knowledge is important, and you're working in your schools to ensure that you are sharing and building knowledge with your students. But let's take a reality check. Uh-oh. Okay. Clicker. There we go. So here's the reality check. The reality check is, unfortunately, most educators in this country do not know that knowledge is a critical part of young children's school experience. And what I'm sharing with you on the screen are the most recent results from NAEP. These are the 2015 results that were just released this past April. Most of you probably know, but I'll explain, that NAEP is a national test that is administered to a wide sampling of students in grades 4, 8, and 12th grade to look at achievement of American students across this country. So let's start by taking a look at the slide on the left-hand side, this graph. These are the NAEP 12th grade reading score trends over a period of 25 years. The first thing that I think you notice immediately is those scores are flat. In fact, there's, a little up and down, certainly not a lot of up. Hopefully you can also see that middle point, there are 3 levels. One is considered not proficient, the middle line is proficient, and the top line is above proficiency, you'll see that it looks like, over that 25-year period, 12th graders' reading achievement has fallen, looks like slightly below proficiency. That doesn't sound like it's too much for concern. Well, I want to call your attention now to the right side of the slide, which gives you the full story. And this is even more distressing. This side of the slide actually represents subject area scores. And again, here we're looking at the 3 columns are 4th, 8th, and 12th grade. I'm going to focus just on the 12th grade and look at reading. And that's about 3/4 of the way down the slide. If you look at reading, what it shows is that 37% of 12th graders are proficient in reading in this country when they leave high school. Let me say that another way, in case that is not daunting enough. That means, if I did my math right, that 63% of 12th graders leaving high school are not proficient in reading. Okay? Let's look a little deeper, and hopefully you'll start making connections between what you heard Robert saying yesterday with the rhyme and reason to these scores. Let's take a look at the top of that chart. There is actually a subject area test in civics. Okay, that was pretty bad, reading, 63% not proficient. All right, we look at civics. 24% of 12th graders are proficient. That means 76% of 12th graders are not proficient, are not knowledgeable in civics. Okay, let your eye scan down the chart. We'll come to geography. Geography, 20% of 12th graders are not proficient, i.e., or 20% are proficient, i.e., 80% are not proficient. And perhaps the saddest of all, but that whole little cluster of scores makes me sad, U.S. history, 12% of 12th graders are proficient insofar as their knowledge of United States history. That means 88% are not proficient. And I have to say to you again, to hearken back to Robert's comments yesterday, this gives me great pause. I am thrilled and excited at what the Team CFA schools are doing and what they're all about. But we're all part of the larger American society. And all of these 12th graders make up that society. They will make up the citizens who will be making decisions for all of the students that you're teaching, for my children, for your children. And so we really, as a country, do very much need to be concerned about these findings. As if that were not bad enough, oops, okay, wait a minute. Okay, here we go. If that were not bad enough, I want to dive even deeper into those scores and looking now again at the left-hand side first. I think it very clearly illustrates what Don Hirsch has called the fairness gap in American education, and that is performance gaps amongst groups of students based on racial and socioeconomic groups. Again, Robert referred to the Matthews effect yesterday, this notion that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And what you see here is, in terms of proficiency, and again, this is the reading achievement proficiency of 12th graders. Remember, I said that the average for 12th graders was 37%. Well, the average for white students, 54% of white students are actually proficient in reading, or are below proficiency, sorry. 75% of Hispanic students are below proficiency. 84% of Black students are below proficiency. Again, this is a fairness gap. This is not a reflection of what different students are capable of. It is a reflection of what their experiences have been. Knowledge builds on knowledge. What you're ready to learn at any given point in time depends on what you've already learned. And we can teach students what they need to learn. So it's depressing on the one hand, but if we would, as a country, recognize that the way to go about this is, in fact, by refocusing our attention on that critical piece, building knowledge. This is a problem, and this fairness gap is something that we could do something about. I want to call your attention, too, to the last bullet point on that portion of the screen, because this was actually called out by Peggy Carr, who's the commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics, which administers the NAEP. And she called this out during the press conference in which these results were released, indicating that compared to 2013, one of the most striking trends for the 2015 scores were that scores for the highest performing students actually increased. Scores for the lower performing students actually declined. In other words, the gap got wider. And to quote Peggy Carr, I think that's something that we need to think about. This is a pattern we're seeing in other data. So clearly, we have a problem in terms of fairness. Now let's call our attention to the other side of this slide, and this is the portion that I call the excellence gap. And it's the excellence gap when we look at American students' performance internationally. One of the primary measures is a test that's called the PISA. The results that you see up here are 2012 data representing the percentage of 15-year-old students in each country who performed at different levels on the PISA. PISA, in a nutshell, has a number of different levels. Level 2 is considered the basic level. It's the bare minimum. At that level, the tasks require a reader to locate one or more pieces of information which may need to be inferred and may need to meet several conditions. Level 5, which is at the upper end of the spectrum, is proficient on the PISA. Okay, ready for the bad news here? 17% of American students are below level 2. 8% of American students are at level 5. Let me say that again. 8% of American students are at the proficient level as measured by the PISA. So this ranking that you see, and I'm sure you can't read the names of the different countries, but suffice it to say that the United States is ranked, it's in the bottom 1/3 of all of the countries that are listed here. Just to give you an idea, some of the countries that outperformed the United States: Canada, Belgium, Poland, New Zealand, Australia. This is cause for concern as well. We live, to use an overstated phrase, in a global economy, a global world. We are not, despite the Brexit vote yesterday, we are no longer able to live in isolation. There are lots of folks that have a nostalgia for wishing that we could. But I also might point out to you, and those of you who are core knowledge literate in history may already know this, George Washington, in his farewell address as president, actually warned back in the late 1700s against isolationism in the United States. Interesting. Some things seem to be very cyclical. So let me now come back to my topic and say to you, let's look at what my title is. What I'd like to do, those of you that are familiar with the Common Core standards are familiar with the term close reading. Close reading means helping students unpack the meaning of a passage, or it could even be the meaning of a sentence, or in this case, I want to unpack the meaning of my subtitle, Implementing Core Knowledge with Fidelity for Optimal Impact. What's the knowledge that's assumed here? What am I assuming? Well, I'm assuming that we all have common agreement on what core knowledge is. Well, let's talk about that. The next piece we need to unpack is, what does it mean to implement with fidelity? Well, literally that means implementing something the way it's intended. But what does that mean relative to core knowledge? And oh, by the way, if I'm a teacher, why should I care about that? And finally, what does optimal impact mean? I think that one I can address right now, and it's probably the easiest one for all of us to come to consensus to and nod our heads and say, yeah, I'd agree. That's a reasonable definition. I think we would agree that optimal impact would be maximum student growth in academic achievement. That is, that we would be providing each individual student with the skills and knowledge he or she needs to realize his or her own potential. That's one. But two, the skills and knowledge that he or she needs that will enable that individual to become an engaged and informed citizen. So let's tackle what's core knowledge first. Well, core knowledge is E.D. Hirsch. Dr. Hirsch is close to 90 years old, an extremely prolific writer. By the way, education and core knowledge was not the primary career that he entered into. Dr. Hirsch is well known in literature, and I can't even say the research that he does, humanotics or something like that. But over 30 years ago, he became very interested in the American education system. And these are some of the books that he has written, and hopefully all of you have read at least one of these books. I think it's safe to say that in each of them, Don made a case for why knowledge matters. Why must building knowledge at the early grade levels be a primary focus of early schooling? He also, particularly in the latter books, has explained further the relationship to language and reading. And again, Robert talked about this yesterday. And I do want to parenthetically pause and really try to explain to you why this is so important. We tend to talk about reading comprehension and the fact that knowledge is critical for reading comprehension. It is. The primary reason we talk about reading comprehension is because it is assessed. But as Robert said, and as Don Hirsch has written about, Reading is actually a part of a diverse arena of different competencies that we call language. And having language competency, what does that mean? It's the ability to communicate. And if we break this down even further, we realize there's oral and written language, right? There's also, we can break it down another way, there's expressive language. So if we think oral and written, talking is expressive language. Writing is expressive language. If we talk about the other part of that paradigm, there's receptive language. That's the understanding. So that's where the reading comprehension comes in, right? Reading comprehension, that's understanding written language. But think for a second. What is understanding oral language? What do we call that? We call it listening. We call it listening comprehension. But we don't test that. And here's the scary thing. It's really important as well. Think about this for a minute. Listening comprehension is critical. I thought about this not too long ago relative to our judicial and legal system. In the same way that a broad foundation of knowledge is critical to reading comprehension, a broad foundation of knowledge is critical to listening comprehension. Now, I mentioned our legal system. One of the precepts of our legal system is trial by a jury of your peers. Think about those 12th graders that I just talked about who are not proficient in reading comprehension, who are not proficient, they're not knowledgeable about history, geography, or civics. I'm a little bit scared about the prospect of those individuals making up a jury and being able to use the critical thinking skills and the knowledge that they need to analyze any given situation that may come to trial. So I say to you again, this is more than simply talking about how our students are doing on reading tests. Now, one thing I want to share with you, if you haven't read any of Dr. Hirsch's past books, he has a new book coming out. He may be close to 90, but he's not slowing down. And the new book is aptly called Why Knowledge Matters. It will be out September 2016, so just a few more months, and it will be coming out from Harvard University Press. Some of us have seen advanced copies of it, and I urge you to take a look. In all of his publications, while the theme is the same, knowledge matters, there are always new insights that he brings to bear. So let me go back again and say, beyond E.D. Hirsch, what is core knowledge? Well, in many ways, what I've just been talking about is core knowledge as a set of ideas or the theoretical principles that underlie what I would call a core knowledge approach or practice in a school. Let's look at Don's own words. Nobody says it better than he does. We need to see the reading comprehension problem, and I would add listening comprehension problem, for what it primarily is, a knowledge problem. There's no way around the need for children to gain broad general knowledge in order to gain broad general proficiency in reading and listening. Excuse me. Core knowledge, however, is more than just an idea, thanks to the fact that Don founded the Core Knowledge Foundation some 30 years ago. And he chose to found the Core Knowledge Foundation as a way to translate his ideas into practice in the classroom. So when I think about what is core knowledge? What I think about is something called the core knowledge sequence. Hopefully, this looks familiar to every person in this room. The core knowledge sequence is a set of guidelines, a grade-by-grade outline of the topics, or what we now call domains, and skills that students ought to be taught at each grade level in each subject. So reading, language arts, math, science, history and geography, and yes, world history and American history, and the arts, music and the visual arts. The strength of this document is the intentional and coherent way that these knowledge and skills have been mapped out within and across grade levels so that they do build coherently in a cumulative cross-curricular way that foundation of knowledge. And I will say to you, I wasn't around when the sequence, well, I was around, but I wasn't at the foundation, when the sequence was first created. I never ceased to be amazed at, I'm going to say, literally the brilliance and the care with which this sequence was put together. We at the foundation actually use that sequence as the basis of everything that we do. So when we create publications or curriculum, we are creating those materials on the basis of that sequence. So, to my question, what does it mean to implement core knowledge with fidelity? Step one is that schools that say they are implementing core knowledge make a commitment to teach the topics and all of the topics listed in the core knowledge sequence on grade level. I want to emphasize the importance of teaching all of the topics because it's very easy, and again, I know this, I was a teacher in a classroom. It's easy in the moment of instruction over the course of a year to get thoroughly engaged and excited by students' enthusiasm for a particular domain and topic. And you want to keep going with it, right? But what I want to stress to you at the elementary level is the importance of breadth of knowledge. And again, the strength of the core knowledge sequence is that it had that vision. Think about it. If, as I said to you, topics build from one grade level to another, if the first grade teacher decides to leave out a topic or two in history and science, that means those students are less well prepared as they go into the next grades for the point in time when those topics will come up again. So it's an important point. So let me try to give you a visual example of how this coherence and accumulation of knowledge builds. And in much the same way that Robert gave a call out to my former colleague Alice Wiggins for her brilliant example of excrescence yesterday, this is another Alice example. So I want you to think about a topic that's in 6th grade science, and the topic is oceans. Now, the content objectives in 6th grade science for oceans include students learning about the subdivisions of the world oceans, subsurface land features, composition of salt water, currents, tides, and waves, and marine life, including plant and animal plankton. Now, you don't start in 6th grade building that kind of knowledge. Just not going to happen. You have to start much earlier to support and lay the foundation for what will be coming in 6th grade. So we start literally in kindergarten. Oop, you were supposed to see that slide a minute ago. So in kindergarten, we start with the following domains. We start with plants, animals and their habitats, seasons and weather, and taking care of the earth. And then each of these topics is going to build cumulatively in a very intentional and thoughtful way across the grades. So the plants domain actually continues to build in subsequent grade levels and build background knowledge for things like living things in their environments, life cycles, ecology, and plant structure. The animals and habitats domain from kindergarten actually builds cumulatively over the course of other grade levels. Again, living things in their environment and classification of animals. The taking care of I skipped one. The seasons and earth domain builds cumulatively across different grade levels in areas like matter, seasonal cycles, and meteorology. Finally, the taking care of the earth domain builds cumulatively in areas like ecology and geology. So that by the time students get to sixth grade, they're actually able to tackle that set of objectives on the ocean. So the puzzle pieces that have been the foundation for which have been laid in the early grades come together in a very intentional way. Again, knowledge building on knowledge in an intentional and systematic way. So, step one, as I said, is implement the sequence, and that means implementing the topics on the grade levels they were intended and implementing all of the topics. The next several steps I'm going to describe to you are actually the model that the foundation has used over, I'm going to say, the last 25 or so years in terms of helping schools who wanted to get started using core knowledge. And step two, this probably will sound familiar to many of you. Step two, if you're a school that wants to use core knowledge, is to create an annual plan for each grade level. The annual plan for each grade level essentially identifies what sequence you're going to teach the different domains and topics in over the course of the year, and also how many days instructionally you're going to allocate to those sequence and topics over there. You see, you have to think and plan all of this out ahead of time, or what happens again in the midst of actually doing the teaching during the year, you lose sight and you'll get to the end of the year and say, oops, didn't get to half of the stuff I thought I was going to do. How many of you in here, just by show of hands, have participated in your school either in creating an annual plan or at least are aware of the annual plan for your grade level? Okay. I am hoping that the hands that are not showing are from non-teachers. The next step after you have an annual plan is to create what we call maps for each topic, and we call these domain maps. Essentially, think of it as a unit plan. What are the objectives that I want to hit in teaching this domain? What are the ways that I'm going to teach it, activities and so forth? What kinds of assessments am I going to use? Now, creating both the annual plan and the maps really requires some very deep thinking. Again, this is, if you think this is easy, think again. Let me show you again what I mean. So in kindergarten, students learn about Columbus and his exploration of the New World. And so you might think to yourself, if you're a new school starting core knowledge, well, gee, if I'm going to create my plan for the year, I know when I want to teach Columbus. Columbus Day is in October. Wouldn't that be a logical time to teach Columbus? Well, it is if the only thing you're thinking about is trying to align with a holiday. Doesn't make so much sense if you look at the other domains and topics in kindergarten history and start to analyze, well, what do students need to know in order to understand the significance of Columbus's voyage and exploration? Well, what you start to think about are things like, well, who sent Columbus on his voyage? Well, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand sent Columbus. So, maybe it would be a good idea if in kindergarten, before we teach about Columbus and his voyage, we teach about kings and queens so that students really understand. The next thing we might say is, well, who did Columbus meet when he arrived in the New World? Well, he met indigenous people. He met Native Americans. So, before we teach about Columbus, we probably should teach about Native Americans. Oh, and how did Native Americans live? How did it differ? How did their way of living differ from Europeans like Columbus? Well, Native Americans sustained themselves principally by hunting and some farming. So maybe it would be a good idea if we also taught about plants and farms. You see that now I'm out of even simply thinking about history domains, but I'm thinking about science topics that are in the kindergarten sequence. That's how carefully this all has been thought out. And so what happens when I start thinking in this way is that we teach in a very different way. We plan instruction in a different way, in a different sequence than we do if we're not aware of all those variables. So let me shift now and say, okay, what does it mean to implement core knowledge with fidelity? And I said before, fidelity means implementing the way that it was intended. Now, if as a school you have created those annual plans and you've created domain maps, you still need to take into consideration some of the other research, particularly in cognitive science, that E.D. Hirsch and certainly others have written about since the initial founding of the Core Knowledge Foundation and since the creation of the Core Knowledge sequence. We've learned a lot from cognitive science research about how people learn, and in particular about how young students learn. We know that when teaching new topics, new knowledge to students, we need to link abstract concepts to something concrete. I sat in on 2 wonderful sessions this morning presented by Liz Ogden and Erica from Pioneer, and then the latter section presented by Lisa, Heidi, and Kathy from TJ that were wonderful examples of how to link abstract concepts with the concrete. We also know from cognitive science that you need to provide opportunities to practice, and we know that the best practice is practice distributed over time. We also know that you need to assess knowledge and skills to better inform and adjust instruction. And oh, by the way, there's been recent writing about the fact that assessment, and in this case, again, it's curriculum-based assessment. We're talking about assessment done in the classroom. Assessment actually boosts retention, so that's a good thing. So all of these practices, I think, would be fairly described as best practices. They're not particularly unique in any way to core knowledge in particular. They're certainly practices that all teachers implementing core knowledge should be aware of. But what else in cognitive science in particular has E.D. Hirsch called out in his writings? I want to talk a little bit again about something Robert alluded to that I'm going to call the vocabulary connection. Said another way, think of it as students need to learn about the world, i.e. knowledge. They also need to learn about words, i.e. vocabulary. And in many ways, vocabulary represents knowledge. So this is why we talk about, for a particular topic or domain, there are domain-specific vocabulary that students learn as well. We know more from research as well on how vocabulary is learned. I want you to think back to the little exercise Robert had you do yesterday using the word excrescence, which you all, I now know, remember, means a slight outgrowth or projection that may be something unusual. And see, I just provided distributive practice, so I reinforced what you learned yesterday. But what we know about how vocabulary learned is in some ways a little perhaps counterintuitive for teachers. As Robert stated, vocabulary is learned implicitly and incidentally. What that means is we do not learn vocabulary by looking words up in a dictionary and then memorizing dictionary definitions. And typically, we don't learn vocabulary through direct instruction. If Don Hirsch were here, he would say, and besides which, and this goes to Robert's example of the thousands, what did you say yesterday, Robert? 60,000 vocabulary words that high school students know. If you had to do all of that by direct instruction, they wouldn't know by the end of high school. So it's a opportunity cost question as well. Instead, we know from research that students learn teeny bits of understanding what a particular word means, what Robert called the gist of a word. When they're exposed to that word over time and in different contexts. This has really important implications for our instructional materials and instructional approaches. I know that many times teachers are now very much aware of the importance of vocabulary. Everybody, and I heard it today in different sessions, people talk about tier 1, 2, and 3 vocabulary, talk about domain-specific vocabulary, general academic vocabulary, vocabulary. And so people are aware that this is important. So I see lots of educators, lots of times, looking at instructional materials and saying, well, let me look in this particular set of materials to see if I can identify whether it has certain features to support vocabulary learning. And I want you again to think back and hold in your mind the research I just shared with you. You're not going to see in core knowledge materials dozens of workbook pages or activity book pages on vocabulary and definitions. It's a much more subtle approach than that. And I'll talk more in a few minutes when I highlight CKLA, the Core Knowledge Language Arts program, what that subtlety is. There's one more piece I want to highlight that Don has in particular written about in recent years and has certainly influenced the Core Knowledge Foundation manner in which we create materials. And that's this notion of staying on a topic, studying one of the topics from the Core Knowledge sequence for, generally it's a minimum of 2 weeks. Sometimes it's longer, depending on the content included in that topic. And that's done for a very specific reason, again, based on research. So the benefits of staying on a topic are, and this has been shown through research, that it enables one to more rapidly and more enduringly acquire vocabulary. And again, think about it. If you learn vocabulary over a repeated series of exposures by staying on that topic, by hearing about and reading about oceans in 6th grade for 2 to 3 weeks, you are going to accelerate that vocabulary and knowledge learning. I want to call to your attention some interesting research that actually was new to Don, that we became aware of a year or so ago by a researcher whose name is Gina Cervetti. She's out of University of Michigan, I think, and I've cited her here. Cervetti, Wright, and Wong. Google her on Google, and you'll be able to pull up this research. It's called No More Word Lists, Teaching Vocabulary in Context. And to just give you an overview of what her study was about, she actually worked with 4th graders, and she wanted to take a look at the effect on reading comprehension for 4th graders, depending on the materials, how the materials they read were selected. So one treatment group was the, if you will, staying on a topic group. The teacher selected a series of reading texts that happened to be on the topic of birds. And over a period of time, that's what these particular students read in that group. And then they were assessed on their reading comprehension and vocabulary acquisition relative to that topic. The other group of students read randomly selected passages. So on one day, it might have been on birds. The next day, it might have been, I don't know, George Washington. The next day, it might have been dinosaurs. You get the idea. Randomly chosen topics. What she found, which, again, not a surprise to those of us that have been following vocabulary research, is that those students who stayed on a topic showed significantly increased achievement and acquisition of vocabulary as well as reading comprehension of what they were reading. So what I have to say at this point, I'm basically sharing with you, if you're creating your own set of materials, we talked about, you already did the annual plan, you're doing domain maps, right? And again, that's not where it ends, because now you need units, and guess what? You need daily lesson plans. And this was essentially, as I said, this is the model the Core Knowledge Foundation used for many, many years, quite simply because there weren't materials out there for teachers to use. You had to create those materials. So from my perspective, suffice it to say that I think it's a daunting prospect to keep all of these principles, these theoretical underpinnings of core knowledge in mind as you're actually creating those plans and the maps and the units and the lessons to teach using core knowledge. So what does it mean to implement core knowledge with fidelity? Well, no pun intended, it's a daunting task. And again, I want to reference Robert. I've said your name more often, Robert, today than I probably have in the last 10 years. But Robert wrote a fascinating blog post recently on, can I say, the idiocy of expecting teachers who, are in the classroom however many hours a day. Before class, they're prepping. After class, they're correcting papers so that they know how their students are doing. And seriously, we expect teachers to be creating curriculum in their spare time? Doesn't make sense. Does not make sense. And I do want to acknowledge at this point that there are any number of amazing teachers over the years that I've been at the foundation, because as I said, this is the model we had. It was the best we could do. Amazing teachers who have put in the hours and hours and commitment to creating these units and lesson plans, which we share online. But as I say, in terms of a model for the nation of how our national education system should operate, it does not make sense. Because essentially you have every teacher reinventing the wheel. So a number of years ago, actually I think 9 or 10, was a pivotal turning point for the foundation when we decided that we were going to create a complete, comprehensive curriculum for English language arts and reading. Now, prior to that time, don't get me wrong, the foundation over 30 years has cranked out a plethora of publications, supports, materials for teachers and students. But Core Knowledge Language Arts was our first attempt at creating a comprehensive curriculum. How many of you in this room are actually using Core Knowledge Language Arts at this point? Okay, lots of hands. In developing CKLA, we developed a two-strand approach to teaching reading. And here again, I'm going to go fast because I think you all know this, but this is an approach that, again, looks at what are the skills and knowledge that students need to be competent readers. They need the knowledge, and so we created the listening and learning strand, where students, particularly in the early grades, K through 3, listen to read-alouds that stay on a topic at least for 2 or 3 weeks, and then are interacting with their teachers and talking about that topic. Now, here's the key. We did not randomly select content-rich topics for each grade level. No. Again, we used the core knowledge sequence as that basis because we knew in so doing we had a sequence and a plan that would build then in language arts incrementally from grade level to grade level. And I will say, for those of you who are not familiar, listening and learning has both fiction and nonfiction selections. I want to mention to you something I'm very excited about. The University of Virginia was just awarded a very large Institute of Educational Science, IES Research Award, and they will be researching specifically the listening and learning strand and rate of vocabulary acquisition. Unfortunately, I'm impatient. I would like to have those results now. I know that we have lots of anecdotal evidence. I heard that this morning in the different sessions where teachers were talking about, it's amazing to go into a classroom and listen to the language and the conversations that are taking place. Very young students who are using CKLA. But this will be the first opportunity to get hard data. And so this really is exciting. They are using this first year as a startup year. They're recruiting schools. Something like 48 schools across the country will be involved. So it's going to be a large study in terms of sample size. It'll be a 3-year study, so it'll be a couple of years before we have all the results, but exciting. Somewhere in here, I missed a slide. I feel like Heidi and Kathy and Lisa. I talked about it being a two-strand approach. Let's just pretend I showed you, maybe I did and didn't talk about it, that there's also at that K through 3 level a strand on skills. That's the decoding piece. So the two of those, skills teaching and the knowledge teaching, are happening simultaneously through different mechanisms. Does that make sense to you? And it's only in 4th and 5th grade where it comes together in an integrated way. And if you think about it, I think you'll think that makes sense, because by the end of 3rd grade, actually by the end of 2nd grade, for many, many students using CKLA, they have gotten that decoding piece down. That's no longer it doesn't require the enormous suck of cognitive attention and energy that it does early on. So again, CKLA was developed with the domains designed to follow a specific sequence. Again, they come from the core knowledge sequence. So there's vertical articulation within a grade. This is actually 2nd grade that I'm showing you a series of topics. And what I mean by vertical articulation is that the topics, even within a grade, are aligned such that they build on one another. So in 2nd grade, students through read-alouds are learning about early Asian civilizations, they're learning about the ancient Greek civilization, and they're also learning about Greek myths. And those of you who know the core knowledge sequence well know, hey, in 1st grade, they learned about Egypt and Mesopotamia. In 3rd grade, they're going to learn about ancient Rome. So the common denominator there is, what is a civilization? What are the features that make up a civilization? And this is an example of the vertical articulation. It builds horizontally as well. The highlighted slides or the highlighted topics and domains, I can't read the writing because it's too small even in my notebook, but I believe are showing growth of an American history topic over the different grade levels. So what does it mean to implement core knowledge CKLA with fidelity? It means all of the things that I said earlier relative to staying on a topic, doing all of the domains within a grade level, and so forth. It means other things, and these were mentioned by a number of folks doing presentations this morning. It means not cutting off and not doing half of the lesson. These are 60-minute lessons. They are designed in listening and learning to be subdivided. So you're not sitting and working with students for 60 minutes. You're doing the read aloud for approximately 30 minutes, and then the materials ask you to come back later in the same day and do what's called an extension. I can't tell you how many schools I go out to, and the teachers will tell you, we're doing CKLA, we're doing listening and learning, and they're doing the read aloud, and I say, when are you doing the extension? Oh, we don't have time to do that. That's critical. You're missing the power of what has been built in to this program. So, what I want to share with you quickly is the exciting work that the foundation is working on now. And that is using CKLA as, if you will, the first piece of the core knowledge curriculum series. We are committed as a foundation to creating curriculum materials for the other subject areas. We are focusing primarily right now on history, geography, civics, and the arts. Also beginning early work on science. In math, I'll tell you right now up front, we are not doing a math program. Plenty of other people have done that. What we are, however, going to do, because we're actually overdue doing this. We have, for years, recommended different math programs to schools using core knowledge. We are going to re-examine those recommendations, look at the new math materials that have since come out, and we will do this with subject matter experts, math professors, to make some recommendations to schools in terms of math materials. But But the idea here is that we want to create a set of curriculum materials that all work together. One of the things that I too acutely realize is the challenge that teachers and educators have in terms of fitting it all in. Fitting it all in, whether you're talking about within a day or within the year. You know, if you had unlimited time, it wouldn't be a problem. No sweat, we could do it. But you don't have unlimited time. And so one of the things that we are actually doing and we've actually already done in thinking about this comprehensive curriculum, is to set out on a grade level for an annual year a pacing guide showing how all of these different materials will work together over the course of the year. In third grade, K through third grade, we are using a metric of 135 days per year. Now, you're in school for longer than that, right? We know you do other things. You do go on field trips and do lots of things. So 135 days seems reasonable at those grade levels. For grades 4 and 5, our metric is going to be 160 days. So literally what I'm saying to you is we are mapping out how you can do the core knowledge sequence topics in the amount of time that you have allocated to you over the year. You already have pacing guides in the top 2 lines on this guide, which again, I know you can't read, but the color coding, the top 2 lines are actually the CKLA program, both the skills units as well as the listening and learning domains mapped out over the year. And then that very next line that you see, it's kind of orange ochre, represents the pacing guide for the history, geography, civics, and arts materials that we've already laid out. So just to give you an example, in grade 3 in listening and learning, some of the topics starting at the beginning of the year, and this should be familiar to those of you who use CKLA, are classic tales, which in listening and learning is Wind in the Willows, classification of animals, then the study of the human body, ancient Rome, and so on. So in history, we will start out with the first unit is actually a geography unit. World rivers. The second unit is ancient Rome. Third unit will be Vikings. Now, wait a minute. I said the second unit in history is going to be ancient Rome. Are some of you saying, hey, wait a minute, but we're already doing ancient Rome in CKLA. Why do I need to have 2 periods during the day that are on the same topic? Think about that for a second. What did I share with you a few minutes ago about staying on a topic and accelerating vocabulary learning? That the more exposures you have, the more durable the learning is and the faster. So the notion here, and this is really coming from Don Hirsch, is that if we actually provide 2 exposures to these topics, wow, kids are going to take off. Now, mind you, I am not talking about using the same texts. That would be boring, to use a child-friendly phrase. I am talking about in CKLA, it's one set of texts that students listen to during read-alouds. In history, it will be a different set of texts on ancient Rome on the same topics that will reinforce one another. So here's an overview of the history units that we are going to be creating. I think I said we're working on grades 3 and 5 this year. I made a commitment in an email to Core Knowledge Schools a number of months ago and said, we will have, for grades 3 and 5, units available for you to use in the 2016 to 17 school year. And we are going to be able to do that. The units are going to be available, the materials will be available in a number of different ways. I don't want to get ahead of myself, so let me come back to that. But again, let me reiterate that for the beginning of this school year, we will have materials for 3 and 5, and we are rolling out in a just-in-time, as-needed basis for the rest of the year. So you'll have, if you're a 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teacher, you'll have those materials. What if you're not at those levels? K2, we will start in early 2017, as soon as we finish 3 to 5, and I am happy to say to you, at the risk of having people pelt me, I have heard those of you who keep saying, where are the middle school materials? And we are, while we had not originally planned to do grade 6, you've made the case, I get it, particularly those schools that have K to 6 in a single building. We are going to be therefore doing K through 6 for these history, geography, civics, and arts materials. We presently already have 1 unit up online, posted on our website. It's been up for a while because we are so excited and we wanted you to see it. So go to the website. If you go to the homepage, you will easily see how to get there. The unit that is presently up is on medieval Europe for 4th grade. For every unit, we will have a highly engaging student edition, or a student reader, if you will, a teacher guide that will be easy to use. Guess what? I had the brilliant idea that we ought to embed within the history teacher guide what is the background information that teachers need to know in order to teach this unit. Presumably, teachers ought to know more than the kids know, right? So that's in the introduction to each of these teacher guides. The lessons in the teacher guide essentially focus on, it looks very much like CKLA. There's core vocabulary, focuses on looking at materials for teaching that chapter. But here's the fun part. In addition to teaching simply reading that chapter, there are additional materials, and the time is allotted annually to allow you to select lots of different options for integrating, again, the arts and virtual field trips. How about going to visit the Middle Ages Museum in Paris? Well, you can do that virtually, and that's all built in. I'm going to wrap up, but I want to quickly mention to you that a shout out to Lisa, who spoke earlier this morning. I stole an idea that Lisa shared with the whole entire Team CFA family several years ago. She talked about it again this morning. And that is, she got up on the stage at a previous CFA conference and talked about her experience in terms of becoming an American citizen. And she said something that stuck with me. She said, everything I needed to know for the U.S. citizenship test, I learned in what your 4th grader needs to know. And I thought, we ought to be able to do something with that. So there will be a feature woven throughout these set of history materials called The Pathway to Citizenship that actually will capitalize on that insight that Lisa shared. And at the end of 5th grade, there will be an opportunity for students to take a citizenship test. Okay, here's the best part. The materials, as I said, are going to be up online, available for free download. Yes, I said free download. So You know, you're lucky in the Team CFA schools. You have all the nifty projection equipment that you need. You can download, print the teacher guides, throw them into a 3-ring binder, and then the student readers, if need be, you can project. We're also going to offer these for sale in print and as e-publications. The e-publications will be available, the digital version of the reader and the teacher guide will be available this school year through Amazon for each of these units. Do I look tired? Now you know why. The print materials, unfortunately, I had hoped we would be able to make available this year. They will not be. Just too risky. So lastly, I'm going to finish up with just mentioning to you that we are working on science. We are actually creating detailed science maps, and we already have all of the maps for kindergarten up online. The rest of them will be going up over the summer months as well. What I want to close by is by saying that I really have tried to pull back and give you the big picture view. It struck me this morning as I sat in the different sessions with the wonderful strategies that all of the teachers were sharing about how to support teaching of core knowledge. It's a constant need to toggle back and forth between big picture and the details, like the nitty-gritty of how you do this. But it's important that you not lose sight of that big picture. So I hope that that narrative that I tried to share with you just now makes sense. I will tell you, particularly because I didn't quite get through everything I had planned to on fidelity and why that's important, that I will be doing a second session tomorrow, primarily directed to directors, but I think interesting to teachers as well. The title of that is School-Based Instructional Leadership, How to Support Classroom Implementation of Core Knowledge, and that will be How to Support Classroom Implementation of Core Knowledge with Fidelity. So thank you very much.